Hey everyone, before we get started with episode 38 of FECast, Building the Tournament Winning Decks, and by the way, it is episode 38, not episode 39, as I'm going to say later on in this one, I have a couple of announcements I need to make. FECast needs your help. We're looking for an editor to take the audio of FECast, polish it up, and put it on the web. Someone to take over that responsibility in the future, and that's because I'm going to be starting a full-time job in a few weeks, and it's going to leave me very little time to do, well, all of the things that I'm trying to do on a weekly basis right now. There is some compensation available, so if this interests you, please contact me either via Discord or Twitter. Just send me a message. One more note, if you're not already a part of the Friends of Eternal Discord, it is the best place to get better at Eternal on the web. We have players that are, well, ranging from all different skill levels, and a lot of the great players that you see in the game today got their start in the FE Discord, and I don't think that's any mistake. I think that there's a great wealth of fantastic information for people aspiring to get better and play in competitive Eternal. So link is in the description. Be sure to join if you're not already a part of the community. Finally, we have a new patron to welcome to our team. FECast is made possible by our generous patrons over at patreon.com. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to keep doing this every week. So a huge thanks to Cotillion, who joins Ryder, Alcide Bava, Sigma Tank, Work Done Son, Chamomilk, Chrissier, Yeast Out, and D-Dub in their continued support of FECast and all things Friends of Eternal. All right, without any further ado, we're going to get started with part one of Building the Tournament Winning Decklist with special guest and Throne Challenge winner, Batteriez. Hello everyone, and welcome to FECast episode 39, Building the Tournament Winning Decklist. I am your host, Sunyveil, and as is often the case, I am joined by my co-host, Stormblessed. How are you doing, my friend?
I am doing really well. We just came off of an exciting summer challenge event, and joining us today is my teammate and friend, Batteriez, also known as Ratteries, also known as Totaries, the meme-tastic rat cage champion.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. This is your first time on FECast, right? I mean,
that is true.
We definitely was on the short list of people that I wanted to invite to the cast. So we have a lot to talk about today. We've already discussed the possibility that this episode is going to be split in two, and going to be a two-parter. But holy cow, do we have a lot to talk about. Batteriez being a tournament-winning deck builder, and myself being a tournament-winning deck builder, and Stormblessed being at least a top 8 deck builder. I mean, you'll get there someday, my friend. But
I hope so.
We wanted to spend this episode talking about building the tournament-winning deck list. I mean, that is a very important skill. We talked about how, or I guess I talked about how crucial it is to have a good deck going into a tournament, because the better your deck, the better your chances of doing well in that tournament are.
Yes, but before we get into the ins and outs of building a deck list, we are going to discuss the changes to Eternal right now. As always, we are going to first discuss the nerfs and buffs that we think are relevant, and then we're going to discuss the expedition changes, because in addition to a variety of balance changes, Darwolf has also added a bunch of new cards to Expedition that should change the landscape of Expedition significantly.
Yeah, so 2 weeks ago we had the Summer Expedition Challenge, which was absolutely dominated by Rakano. It wasn't even close. 14 out of the top 16, and we talked about that last week. And as expected, we saw some nerfs to Rakano. Silverblade Intrusion now requires 6 Justice Influence, and requires 6 cards in the enemy player's hand to play an additional Valkyrie Denouncer. Friends in Low Places now only requires single fire, single justice, but both halves of the thresholds you need for the added effects require 8 pips of that faction. Not only that, they are reduced.
They also removed Plunder from the card, no longer plunders as well. So it now only gives the +4/+4, and then if you have 8 of each, which if you haven't already, take a look in Client and look at the card, because it is ridiculous to look at. It's so silly to look at. Like, it's 8 of each. It's like 16 pips on a card.
Removing plunder is a pretty big nerf too.
Also, one more change to friend in low places, and now the justice side of the card says draw the unit that of 4 costs from the top 4 cards of your deck and give it Aegis instead of playing the unit for free, and that's a huge deal. I think part of what made friends in low places so ridiculous is that you got so much power effectiveness for such a low investment, and now that is the potential for that is much less than it used to be.
Wow, I didn't even realize that it was draw unit.
There was just so much taken away from that card. So much taken away.
To be fair, it was like completely busted.
Finally, the last change is that Ironthorn Lawman is now a 3-1 from 3-2, which I think is a pretty reasonable change. I actually am kind of glad that they didn't gut Lawman because I thought it provided a reasonable or a unique effect. So what do you guys think about these changes? I think that I was not happy with Silverblade Intrusion, and I'm really happy that I think it's just not that good anymore. And Friends in Low Places, it changes how the card functions. Now it's primarily a pump spell instead of a primarily I win the game spell.
There's some huge nerfs to Intrusion Flip. It'll be really hard, I think, for those cards to see play. You're really gonna have to flex what the card can always do and make sure that is very important to your strategy. And then the rest of it is kind of upside in the later game that maybe you can get value from, rather than being part of the strategy as well.
I think that Intrusion is still mostly the same. I think that Intrusion's still going to be very good. I'm glad that it now requires 6 cards instead of 4 cards in hand, because that was just ridiculous. But I think Intrusion will still be relatively decent. I think Friends in Low Places, Philp or Flip, is just completely gutted. I think it's just so much worse. However, I do like that they changed the influence cost to just 2 Fire Justice. It does you put up some potentially interesting opportunities to say put it in the market of a Fire Justice Shadow deck, which could sometimes not get to double fire a lot of time, and did get to 8 Justice because you want to get to a backbreaker. So I think that you could potentially open up some interesting market potential for Friends in Low Places, but it's still ultimately far worse. And then Ironthorn Lawman being acceptable to Blight Moth and other ping effects, I think, is a fine change.
I don't know what you're talking about putting in Friends at Low Places in the market. That doesn't sound good to me. I feel like if you're trying to get up to the thresholds, you're not using it primarily as a pump spell, which is what its function is going to be going forward. I think it's probably a fine pump spell in Rakano decks going forward, but it's just that's what you have to use it for instead of just winning games with it and not much else.
Yeah, if I was playing Rakano aggro and I wasn't looking to play this in the main deck moving forward as a pump spell, if I'm looking at a salvo market or even just a justice-based market, I'm still probably going to put it in the market because it's still a +4/+4 pump and it can still get you a lot of value in the late game, which is good to have on a card.
There's one more nerf that we haven't talked about yet, and that is Helio the Skywinder now costs 6 in a primal. And this was one that I suggested on my Twitter. I am happy to see it. I think that Helio wasn't dominating the metagame as it was, but with these changes to the Rakana cards, I think that there's a pretty good potential for it to really break out, and I'm glad that they're taking a step against that, because I think we would have seen a ton of Helio decks, and I think we're still going to see a lot of them, but I think this is a good way of toning it down.
Yeah, making it, it's more impactful than you think, because, you really don't want to play Helio until it's 6 primal anyways, so putting it to 6 doesn't really change that aspect of it, because, you weren't probably playing it on turn 5 most of the time anyways. But what it does really do is, on turn 6, you can't play it and Permafrost. On turn 8, you can't play it and Turn to Season / Hailstorm. So reducing its efficiency does weaken the card. It's still probably an extremely powerful card. But, if the Heat's Distillation was too powerful, then Helio was definitely too powerful.
Yeah, I think the Helio nerf was fair. Although, it's hard for me to say the Helio nerf was fair when I think Tota Circles draws way more cards anyway, but that's for another time.
Alongside these nerfs, we did get a number of buffs. Nahid's Faithful being a 2/2, I think, is the most notable of them. I already thought that Nahid's Faithful was one of the best cards in Eternal, or one of the most powerful cards in Eternal, and now it is bigger, but it's not an expedition. Is it?
No, it's not expedition.
Okay, just making sure, because I was trying to build a deck with it, and I was like, wait, it's Yeah, okay. Good. I'm glad to see that. We also have Accelerated Evo and Safe Return being unnerfed. They're both going down to 2 and 1 cost respectively. I think that Accelerated Evo going down to 2 is more interesting than Safe Return going down to 1. I never thought Safe Return was that good. I felt like it was a really overrated card, both in draft and in constructed, because it involves a lot. In order for the card to be good, it requires a lot of investment into a single unit, and those strategies already have stuff that they're weak to.
Yeah, I think that that the Nahid's faithful buff is huge. I think that making it so when it sacrifices a unit, it becomes a 4/4, which means that it can dodge Torch, Seer, and Hailstorm, which is really important for a deck playing Nahid's faithful because it's probably a go wide token deck. So having a unit that survives your common removal and common board clear is going to be really huge for the card. Accelerated Evo going to 2 is going to be huge because that card was very powerful, and cards with Echo and Fate that give you another card are just getting better and better, especially with Plunder. So giving us another powerful option really will open up some doors in Throne for some interesting gameplay.
Yeah, I really like both the Evo and the Heat Faithful buff. They both the things you guys already said on it. I have played around with like TPS aggro before that wanted to play Faithful and looked to play Evo before, so I'll probably look at that deck again. Also, interestingly, is both of those buffs are TPS, so maybe they could fit into Rats, if they're strong enough. Rats wins a challenge, it gets buffs. Rakano wins, it gets nerfs. Everything is right in the world.
Oh yeah, because these decks are definitely going to be... these buffs are definitely going to have a big impact on that Rats deck.
Yeah, we'll see.
The last buffs that we saw as part of this update are Boulder Gate Guards, Razor Lash, and Silk Habel Strongarm now have Plunder attached to them, as well as their existing effects. And Stormblessed, you think this is a good thing because there might be more Plunder in the future, and I definitely agree, right?
Yeah, I think that, of the three, Razor Lash becomes a good graph card. I hope it comes with a constructed card, but everyone I've talked to says it's not going to be. I kind of on the edge. I want it to be in like an Argenport deck. You can play the Siphoner Paladin, making it a 4/8 decay weapon is cute, but the only one that really is going to impact constructed is really like Sil, Cabal, Strongarm. I've seen people play around with it in Stone Scar now, especially because of we'll talk about in a second, but Stone Scar gets a smuggler, so giving a powerful Stone Scar card can sort of all rise the boat tides, right? So but the more important thing is that it indicates that Daryl's willing to give mechanics to cards, and if we're going to get more Plunder in the future, I love Plunder. So
yeah, I don't think Plunder is that fantastic in constructed, especially not in Expedition without the Fate Echo cards, and in a format where you really want to count your influence pips. I feel like just getting a sigil usually isn't that good, but it's definitely a nice thing to see for drafts, certainly, and I think having the flexibility is really nice. So alongside these balance changes, we also got a bunch of cards added to Expedition. They did this in the last Expedition format, and I guess they're just going making a habit of it. So the standouts are you can check the full list on the Direwolf site, and we'll link it. But the standouts are Smugglers for the non-Silex faction pairs. So for example, Rakano has a Silex. It did not get a Smuggler, but Stone Scar does not have Silex. It got its Smuggler, and that is consistent through all of the 10 2-faction color pairs. Argenport, Instigator, Auric Record Keeper, Bloodseeker, Borderlands Lookout, Obliterate, and Pyro Knight are added as powerful aggro options that have seen play in the past. Shimmer Pack and Shelterwing Rider add interesting multi-faction cards that are we'll see if either of those spawn in deck. We also have another choice for power in the format, and that is Diploseal, which is kind of interesting because it's very opposed to Silex's. What do you think about this? Diploseal, I think, is a very interesting inclusion.
If there's a aggressive aggro deck that doesn't care about your influence at all, then Diploseal, if you play Stone Scar aggro without Sil or Bouton, then I think it could see play. Or I don't know if there's a Comber aggro deck that doesn't care about influence, but if your deck cares about influence in any capacity, if any of your cards require anything more than like a Jack or something, then Diploseal becomes just garbage. So I don't think I'll see much playing Expedition.
It could see playing Todas. I haven't looked at the power base yet to see if I would want to play because I still kind of on the fence about checking that deck. But it could see playing Todas. Todas wouldn't mind a Diploseal, I think.
Yeah, I think some sort of 2-faction aggro deck which for whatever reason doesn't care about influence but really wants to play its 1 and 2 drops on time could end up playing Diploseal. There's Vara's Choice, which is listed here by someone who's not me because I've never liked this card. Okay, who put this on here?
I put Vara's Choice on there.
I'm a fan of Vara's Choice as well. If it depends what you're playing, but sometimes it's good. If there's like really powerful summon effects in the format that you need to potentially answer before they hit the board, or your deck doesn't care as much about the body it'll leave behind when the person replays it, then I think it's okay.
Kind of like it might be a good card in Todas.
Yeah, it could be a good card in Todas. But the sad thing is Todas will probably be swapping off Salvo, unfortunately.
But the one of the keys is that if you're playing sort of a mid-range unit deck, which factions including Xenon traditionally have played mid-range decks, then there's a card called Svetya, which is very good versus unit decks. And so Vara's Choice being able to take out Svetya, as well as also being able to interact with the board if need be, puts it in a spot worth considering, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think I agree with those points. You also usually have the biggest unit on board, so a textless body with relatively irrelevant stats doesn't matter as much.
Oh man, I disagree so hard. I hate Vara's Choice. I've pointed it at players enough and missed enough to just never trust that card. Like, whatever I'm playing, it's probably going to be better than Vara's Choice.
I suppose the fact that it does discard from hand actually, I might actually consider it more for Todas, even in the main deck, because it does discard from hand if it hits in hand. So that's a way to get another Toda, and Todas love making Todas.
If you're wondering why that is, it's because there's a card called Cheering Section, which states that whenever any player discards a card from anywhere, you make a Toda. So that's why discarding matters for Todas. For the audience members that aren't intimately familiar with Cheering Section.
Yeah, which I can't blame anyone if they're not intimately aware of how Cheering Section works.
All right, and the last card that stood out to me is Trailmaker, and I think Trailmaker is going to play a huge role. It provides influence, and it's an accelerant to go alongside what Apprentice Mage I think is the existing 2-drop accelerant in time. So I mean, I don't know what support you have for Trailmaker. I don't know if there's some sort of Praxis tokens like deck in Expedition. I just know that Trailmaker puts in a lot of work when it comes to influence and is generally a very powerful turn 2 play.
It's also a Surge Matters set too, or like Influence Matters set. So the fact that it is added to Expedition is pretty potent. Like trying to hit 5 times for an Oobsot or surging off of some random surge effect can do a lot for you.
Yeah, I mean, you can turn 3 Oobsot, right?
Yeah, you could turn 3 Oobsot.
Yeah, Symbol into Trailmaker
I used turn 3 Oobsot in the Throne challenge. That was just the most recent challenge from last weekend, and one of the Batteriez ended up winning. And turn 3 Oobsot in my mono time deck was really good. And it should be even better in Expedition, where there's more units.
Yeah, and there aren't as many multi-faction units, right? I mean, I guess they're the really powerful ones, the ones that require a ton of influence. But man, just thinking back to the Rakano deck lists, most of those cards were multi-faction outside of Ironthorn, right?
I mean, mono-faction, but yes, there's it really depends, right? I mean, it could also be that the metagame adapts and that multi-faction cards see more play. Like if you see a bunch of Rollants, then Oobsot becomes a little bit worse. But I mean, Oobsot's still just a powerful card. Like, it's still just a 6/4 by itself. It's still a big body.
Yeah. All right, let's get on to the main topic of the day, building the tournament-winning deck list. If you are wondering about our qualifications, well, I've built many decks that have either top-8'd or made the finals or won tournaments, and Batteriez has built one deck at least, right? Is there a deck that you're known for aside from Rats?
I mean, I was kind of like one of the original people to push FTP before it finally became the monstrosity it was. Like I was pushing that deck for quite a few sets before it became the powerhouse that it was. So maybe you could kind of consider that into some, but not really. I think I'm trying to think if I know Muxosk played an FTP deck in like a Worlds qualifying type tournament. I'm not sure how well it did though. That's quite old history for me at this point, though. It's been a while.
But it's undeniable that the word rats in Eternal cannot be uttered without evoking thoughts of Batteriez. And Stormblessed, if anyone recalls Xenon Sights as an archetype.
Yeah, Xenon Sights was the first deck I built that did well at a tournament. And that was a long time ago at this point. But since then, I have been involved on tuning a variety of important decks. Like I did the help finishing tunes from the Rakano deck that took over the metagame, and I helped with original Rats back in the day. And since then, I've also built Carverless Carver and Sea of Teeth, and I built a variety of other good decks that did well at tournaments. So I think I have deck building chops.
I'm surprised you didn't jump to the V word.
I'm leaving that for one week because I think it's a break.
Okay. All right. So, there is so much to talk about with regards to deck building. I mean, it's an imperfect science. I don't think anyone has nailed it down to the letter so far. There's always improvements that can be made with regards to deck building. Even decks that win tournaments can often be improved from those from that configuration. Also, you have to take in mind that anytime you have a deck, it does not exist in a vacuum. It could be powerful in a vacuum, but its effectiveness has everything to do with what is surrounding it. So, a deck that is very good one week, even if no cards change in the format, might not be the same power of deck 3 or 4 weeks later in that format, or even a couple days, I think can make an impact on this. So just keep that in mind when we're talking about all this. So in this era of Eternal, almost every deck has a market, and if you want to learn more about markets, you should definitely check out episode 12 of FECast with Eric9099, where we spent an hour and a half looking at tournament-winning markets. Now, markets have changed a little since then, and we have Wasteland Smuggler, but the core values of that podcast, I suppose, are still very, very relevant today. And if you haven't checked it out already, I strongly recommend it. It'll be linked in the description. The big lesson to take away from that is that the market should be considered an extension of the deck, not an afterthought. You don't build your deck and then build your market. I think that's not the best way of looking at it. I think the idea is to build your deck and make sure that the cards that you want to have an extreme impact when played once, unless you're playing Wasteland Smuggler, in which case it works a little differently. But for the most part, you want to have cards in your market be cards that are like kind of linchpins in your strategy that you're going to play once and it's going to totally turn the game around. Would you guys say that that's...
Yeah, two examples of that I think are the most easy to understand would be Justice markets in Expedition right now. Or in the recent past, there are two cards that stand out to me. Massive Greatsword as being a card to put in the Justice market to be an extension of the deck as a big finishing weapon that if you're not playing, Bladecraft or whatever it has a one of, you really don't want to, draw a Massive Greatsword, but you really want to have access to it. You really want to have a big punchy finisher weapon, and Massive Greatsword fits that bill, and it really fits in the market really well because, making it a flexible card as a Massive Greatsword or something else. But you don't really want to draw it. So Massive Greatsword in the market for Justice. The other one is depending on it's a little bit older of a card, but Restrained Actions, another great card to put in the market as a finishing card you want one of because it really ramps you up. It closes out the game and slowly to some extent, but you don't really want to draw too many of them. So those are two cards that traditionally have been found in the markets as an extension game plan of the deck, especially Restrained Action. Because if you're building a Restrained Action deck, that's your deck, that's your game plan right there. But if you don't put it in the main deck, that market is your deck, right? That's an extension of your deck.
I think one more good example of this is Grasping at Shadows out of Reanimator decks. Nowadays, a lot of the time, there's just one in the market. And that's a card, it's a core part of the game plan, but it doesn't have that much value to your deck except for the exact time when you're trying to play it.
Yeah, and the reason that you'll need the one copy in Reanimator is that if you're playing Grasping at Shadows on turn 5 or 6, by the time that you could play a second copy of it, you can just play the VAR from your hand anyways. So it's less useful on turn 8 than it is on turn 5.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And then an example for me, rats. Like it has Swindler in the market, so that's another way to get Rat Cage out. So you can always like work towards your game plan, extend it a little bit further. Getting multiple Rat Cages is fine. Or like Bizarre Stampede,
Yeah, I was gonna say, isn't the better example Bizarre Stampede?
Yeah, Bizarre Stampede would probably be a better extension. I mean, playing more rats is always, gonna just extend your, but that's not an extension per se, right? Stampede, yeah, you're playing all these unique relics, getting unique effects, and kind of building this engine of like really hard to deal with things. And then Bizarre Stampede is like, okay, well, I'm just gonna convert all that power into just killing you with all these little rats.
Yeah. So markets are incredibly complicated and are very important to the deck. Check out the episode with Eric if you want to learn more about markets. So when you're building your deck, I think it's really important to keep in mind how you're actually going to beat your opponent. I think this is absolutely crucial. And to me, there are three main axes in which decks try to outdo their opponent. The first one is efficiency. Just how quickly can you use your power and how efficiently can you use your power in the early game? Aggro decks fall into this category. If you're just using every single power you have, making an impactful play that pressures your opponent's life, and they are unable to use their power efficiently enough or use enough of their power because they have too many cards that don't impact the board or too many powers that come into play depleted and just don't have access to enough power, that is one way to overpower your opponent and win, is by being more efficient than them and just presenting a game plan that they can't deal with in the time that they have for it. A second axis that you can beat your opponent is the axis of cards. And I think that card advantage is something that's thrown around a lot in Eternal, but it's not as important as people think for the most part, but it is a way to win. I think a good example of this is having a bunch of removal cards and then playing a Helio and then drawing a ton of cards and then maybe playing another Helio. And all of a sudden, if your cards are trading 1-for-1 with your opponent, then you'll just have more stuff than your opponent. It doesn't really matter how you win from there. Another example, I think, is the old Winchester decks that would play like Rezon in order to kill something and then leave behind a big unit, or play something that might require multiple cards to deal with, like Vara, for example, often kills the unit and then takes a removal spell while playing a lot of 1-for-1 removal on its own. That is another deck that looks to outdo its opponents with respect to cards. And so that's a second way for your deck to win against an opponent. And the third way is the axis of effectiveness. And what I mean by this is if you're playing a control deck and you have no units, absolutely no units, and your opponent has cards dedicated to removal, they might be able to get more cards than you. They might be able to outdo you on cards, but because those cards don't do anything, you might be able to pull out a victory that way because your cards are still effective at the end of the game and your opponents are not. Think of a Huru control deck that just doesn't play any units, looks to answer its opposing threats, and then eventually plays a Scourge of Frostholm, and then all of these spells from opposing decks are negated. Another example of this is if you are playing some sort of combo deck or some sort of deck that really relies on relics, something that just pushes its threats all on one axis and your opponent's cards are not effective at dealing with it. If your opponent only has one way of removing a relic in their entire deck and you've got a lot of relics and that's your main threat source, well, your opponent doesn't interact meaningfully with you, and that's a way to win. So those are the three axes which I've identified that you can beat your opponent. Are there more? Did I miss any? What do you guys think?
I think these are definitely like the core axes you should be trying to fight on. Maybe there might be other axes that like develop in a game that you might be able to work on, but I don't think you can really plan to play around. And I can't even think of them at this moment, but I think if I sat down, I might be able to come up with some, but I don't think they're like, this is like your bread and butter, right? Like this is what you should be working with primarily.
I was just say I think that like there's some multifaceted dimensions to these, like the axes of effectiveness. There's a variety of forms of effectiveness. For example, Sandstorm Titan. is just a very effective card in a different way than, Hailstorm is a very effective card, right? They're both effective in what they do in various ways. Like, they're both punchy cards that do things efficiently. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that a lot of times you want to build a deck that kind of goes around two of these axes, not necessarily like one. For example, like mono fire aggro kind of goes for axes of efficiency and axes of effectiveness, and kind of excuse axes of cards. And then there are some other cards that you can use to shore up your weaknesses. For example, Silexes help aggro deck shore up axes of cards, right? Rakano aggro and Expedition and Throne really benefited from having Silex be able to just, get an extra card out of their power. So there are ways to shore up your weaknesses in unobtuse ways, especially with Silexes.
Yeah, so I think that that's an interesting point, but that's more along the lines of not losing rather than winning. Like, you're still going to, like, if you're playing an aggro deck, you're probably not winning on the card's axis, right? You might be pushing the, like, efficiency or effectiveness axis more, and then just make sure that you're not losing too hard on the card axis. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, that's my point with Silex. Also,
yeah, the access of cards might not be as like Silex do play to that, but I think aggro's still, I think basically every good deck in Eternal has ways to fight on at least two of these axes, and then potentially fight on the third axis as well.
Yeah.
I think there's very few decks that actually just completely commit to one axis of beating their opponent.
Yeah, and I think that when you're building your deck, you have to keep in mind what you're trying to achieve here, because, like, Wisdom of the Elders, is it Wisdom of the Elders or Wisdom of the Elders? Holy cow, I'm doubting myself right now.
I'm pretty sure it's Wisdom of the Elders, but now I'm unsure myself.
I think it is Wisdom of Elders, actually.
Let me check Eternal Work right now. No, we must find this out. It's Wisdom of the Elders.
It is Wisdom of the Elders. Oh my goodness.
Anyway,
mind blown.
So that card, or like Honor of Claws, these are generically powerful cards. I mean, they are card advantage. They're inherent card advantage. But if you're playing an aggro deck, they're not going to help you beat your opponent on the axis of efficiency, which is really what you want to do. And that's why you don't see those cards in, like, a Skycrack aggro deck, at least not really successful ones. If you're playing, like, a deck that is trying to be aggressive and operate on the axis of efficiency, it's not worth it to dedicate turns, I think is a better way of putting it, to playing cards like Honor of Claws, because that, if you're fighting up this axis of efficiency and then all of a sudden you take a turn toward the axis of cards, that's not going to help you achieve victory for that game.
Yeah, definitely committing to, like, one axis, like, primarily, like, if you try to commit to multiple axes or all of the axis, you're going to be giving up power in one of them. And so you kind of have to play that balancing act.
Yeah, all you really have to do is beat them in one of these ways.
Yep.
You just have to get all the way to the finish line, so to speak.
Moving on from the axis stuff, I wanted to mention, this is the part that I primarily build my decks around. Like, I know that there are all these other things, but this is my focal point. Is I think consistency is crucial in deck building, and I think that when I look at other decks, what I see most is that there's a lack of consistency, or you could say cohesion or whatever, in the deck. Like, people are playing random 2-ofs that don't do, and that have no, like, overlap with any other effects in the deck. And I think that that's just not what you want to be. I think you want to be as consistent as possible. And of course, the problem is that you also still want to maintain flexibility, right? So there's the balance between consistency and flexibility. If all you played was, 51 drops, you'd guarantee consistently have 1 drops every turn of the game. But, you then not be able to, maximize your axis of effectiveness, I guess you could say. So I just wanted to, looking at specifically 2 of my decks that I had built, I just wanted to mention, like, the consistency aspects of it. It's not that cards have to be the same card, but they have to fulfill similar roles. For example, if you look at my old Xenon sites list, Suffocate, Annihilate, Bar's Favor, Xenon Temple, and Diesel's Office all fulfill requirements of removal in various forms. Teacher of Humility, Amaran Stinger, both do disruptive early game plays in different ways, filling the deck with scorpions, or, making all their cards cost more, makes them more expensive. There's also Banish, which does things. Praxis Arcanum kind of is the oddball out that just kind of does random things, but it kind of fits with the site theme of, doing things. And then Sandstorm Titan, Vara, Moonstone Vanguard, and Worldbearer Behemoth all fulfilled the same goal of producing a big unit to attack with. And of course, in a deck like this, Ebon Dune Smuggler, the smuggler in my market, fulfilled the same goals of basically doing everything. And like all the different types, like Dark Return in the market allowed it to make a unit, and then like Xenon Initiation and In Cold Blood allowed it to do removal things. And then, it did one unique thing with Disjunction as sort of relic removal. And then just to quickly go over the other deck, if you look at my Carverless Carver deck from an old Expedition, which has since been gutted through nerfs, but Combust and Worthy Cause both are big removal spells that do basically the same thing. Display of Destruction is another removal spell. Rectifier, Kato, Entrance Cultist, and Interloper all are corrupted units that allow for sacrifice effects. Nahid's Choice again is just multiple bodies on the ground. Strange Burglar and Gurdal Stranger are both big units to end the game with in various ways. Nahid's Distillation and Strange Burglar are also the card draw of the deck, and then you also have a market which extends that in various ways. And then of course, and I like to say, like, this deck especially, it's playing Nahid's Choice and Display of Destruction. And both the effects of having the flexibility cannot be underestimated, right? People say like, oh, Display of Destruction, it's really just for the sacrifice to get 6 power. And I think if you're doing that, and I think if you think it's just that, then I think you're using the card wrong. I think that I use every mode enough times that it's significant with Display of Destruction. Like for cards like the Fire Time Justice display, which has like gain 2 armor and get to attack, like that card doesn't have 3 modes, but like this card does have 3 modes, and you should use them all. Then the other thing I wanted to mention about consistency is that this relates back to sort of a mathematical understanding of the deck, which mostly corresponds in my mind to, because you can't really math out the whole game, but you can math out your opening hand. And so as we saw, this was especially true with pledge decks of the past, where you wanted, I think it was 16 pledge cards to order it to sort of guarantee that you had a pledge card in your opening hand with all the mulligans. Outside of decks where you absolutely 100% need it, I like to have 12 cards. If you have 12 cards, that gives you, I think, a 92% chance to have at least one copy of the 12 in your opening hand. So I like consistency. I like considering opening hand math, and that's sort of my very quick and dirty exposition on consistency. What are you guys' thoughts on my idea of consistency as far as a deck building topic?
So when you're talking about this Carverless Carver deck, you're talking about a deck that creates its own unique resource and then has to cannibalize it, if that makes any sense. So you're creating a resource of having units and having effects that pay off on sacrificing those units, right?
Yes.
So particularly if you're playing a deck like that, you really need to balance out effects A and effects B, and you want lots of redundancy in both, because the effects that you have that require you to sacrifice a unit, they just don't do anything if you don't have any of the first one. So like in that regard in particular, you really need to make sure that your numbers are balanced out so that you have lots of effect A and then lots of payoffs for effect B, and make sure that you have the resources in order to do that. I think that's a particularly difficult balancing act.
Yeah, that is.
That's why Display of Destruction was so good and crucial in the deck, is and why, if you look at it as just a sacrifice to get 6 power, you were just that was like the best you could do. The deck was playing Display to you play Shrine and Gurdal Stranger in the same turn, attack with a charging Gurdal Stranger the opponent doesn't expect. That was one of the more powerful things that could do. But Display of Destruction also producing 3/1/1s as sacrifice fodder and also acting as sort of lesser removal is what sort of held the deck together, I think.
That type of list is also like something I was working on. I was back on TGP at the time, and we were working on FTS Sec as well, and it is a really big balancing act in that regard, making sure you can consistently fuel your sacrifice engine with fodder. Rats is kind of the same way too, right? Like it has Display of Knowledge, it has Rat Cage, and then it has Crack the Earth, which can grab Swindler. And so those are 12 different ways you can assemble a Rat Cage. or get a rat cage on board in the game, and then really extract the value from your relics. And even just like in regular decks, like a regular aggro deck, like making sure like towards the end of our last conversation about axes, making you're consistent at fighting on the axis you want to win is really important. And after a certain point, though, it kind of drops off, right? And so that's where you kind of start looking at adding other options into your deck, or like ways to like flex your plan and or fill holes that you didn't get or didn't fill.
Yeah, this ties into what Stormblessed was talking about of having, if you have 2 ofs and 3 ofs and whatnot, you want to be able to have the most effective option at the given time. And when you have 3 of a card in your hand, even if it's the best card in the world, that reduces the number of options you have. So like if you have 4 different cards and they all do exactly the same thing, you're not going to have as many options as having a small variety of cards. And granted, you want all these cards to fight on the same axis, but I don't think you want them to do exactly the same thing, if that makes any sense.
No, but that my point about consistency is not that you want them to do the same thing, but like if like this was more true in the Xenon deck, where I said, suffocate, annihilate, Var's Favor, banish, Xenon Temple, and Dealer's Office all act as removal options, but they all do slightly different things, right? And Ebondu Smuggler as well fits in that category, right? So it's like, the sites all act as removal while also acting as sort of a card draw and a board presence effect, and Var's Favor acts as removal while also guaranteeing your power, right? So like, I'm not saying all cards have to be exactly the same. I'm saying they all should fill similar roles, like, Teacher Feeling the Amberance thing, right? They both disrupt the opponent's deck, but they do it in very different ways in a lot, in the cases, right? So it's kind of like, that's why I said, like, you also want to balance between consistency and flexibility. So it's kind of like, the idea of the axis, right? You want to fight on the axis, but not with like the same card. This goes back to my idea of, you don't want to have 51 drops, but you also don't want to have 4 1-drops. If you're playing like only Oni Ronin as your only 1-drop, that's just a bad deck. You either want to have like 12 to 16 1-drops or no 1-drops, right? You either want to play like the 2-drop Stone Scar aggro variant, or you want to play, with the 1-drops. You don't want to just go halfway on either side of the formula.
Yeah, no halfway measures. So and the other thing regarding these 2 decks, this and Rats, I think that I think I would say that both of them attempt to win games on the axis of effectiveness, because they're in positions where like your opponent's removal is just not very effective, right? They operate on a different axis than what the other deck is trying to do, and that makes that like your opponent's cards just don't line up well against either of these 2 decks, because they don't have tons of sweepers or they don't have tons of relic removal.
Yeah, I agree on that effectiveness aspect.
This sort of idea and the idea of the axis effectiveness kind of leads into the next topic, which is sort of looking at the metagame, right? It's not just enough to look at your own deck and to say like, oh, okay, here's my deck, here are the cards I'm going to put in, it's consistent, it's going to do good things. You also have to look at what's in the metagame, right? You have to build your deck around what other people are playing and what's going on in the rest of the format.
Yeah, so sometimes you'll see a deck and you'll be like, boy, this sure has a lot of bad cards, or a lot of cards that I don't think should be constructed playable, and yet it will do surprisingly well. And oftentimes it is doing exactly what you said. It's finding a niche or weakness in the metagame. By niche, I mean it's doing something that no other deck is trying to do. If you have a metagame where everyone is trying to play for the long game and there's no aggro deck, all of a sudden there's a niche for an aggro deck to pop up and do well because people aren't prepared for it. Or like if there is a single card that really shuts down certain strategies that is no longer a part of the metagame, those open up a place for decks full of what I call bad card decks or whatever. So an example of this is like relic based decks. If there are boars everywhere in the format, you do not want to be playing relics. But if people only have one way of destroying relics in their entire deck and they can only destroy a relic once, you can get away with just playing a lot of powerful relics and your opponent just won't be able to interact with you. Another example is if you are playing a really aggressive deck that just dies to Lightning Storm, or it dies to Blight Moth, or it dies to Var's Favor, or it dies to Sandstorm Titan, and those cards aren't present, an opportunity arises for a deck that is really weak against those cards to be very good. And I think that's that's what I think propelled my monofire aggro deck when I won the Throne Championship.
Yeah, like for example, like when everyone was playing 4 main deck Pride Leaders, Rats was kind of terrible, right? But once people aren't playing main deck Pride Leader or like main deck Marley, then Rats suddenly becomes a lot better because if you're not playing just the incidental hate cards, then suddenly I can just make some Rats and make another Rat and then poke you with my Rats a bit and then stampede over you with Bazaars.
Ironically, I don't think Relicate is actually the niche where relics or Rats find its opening to be a good deck. I think the formats where Rats really find their niche is where there's not good efficiency or effectiveness. Let's see, what was our first axis? Efficiency. Right. Like if there's not good aggro decks that can actually punish you for like setting up these engines, because like even Relicate,
not blocking.
Yeah, you could kill. Yeah, I mean, I think aggro definitely had a time to shine and could have beaten up Rats, but I don't think there was enough good aggro decks in the meta that could actually beat Rats fast enough before they could set up, right? Because like even if you try to answer like Rat Cage or you answer some of these relics, generally Rats either pumped out a bunch of Rats and so you're still going to get beat down by stuff, or they could still like they could always assemble it again. So like even if there's Relicate in the format, I think the big thing where Rats find a niche is when there's not like a really good proactive deck like Praxis Pledge destroyed Rats because it was very, very fast and it was very effective at what it did.
And Stone Scar aggro also destroys Rats in a lot of ways. Not, I mean, it's less
a good,
extent, but
a good Stone Scar list will. Right now, I think a lot of people are kind of playing bad Stone Scar because they're playing a lot of these like flashy 4-drops and like not enough 2-drops and 3-drops to like actually pressure you and kill you, and so you can just like play perma on one unit, equivocate this 4-drop, and they just did nothing all game and you destroyed them,
I agree that one boar in the market wasn't enough to stop Rats, but I do think 4 Pride Leaders in the main deck was enough to keep Rats down because Pride Leader
comes out on turn 4. It doesn't kill a Rat Cage fast enough for you not to get Rats out of it. It fights against Rats in multiple access. Yeah. So it's still pretty good. It's better than most Relicate options since you also get a nice blocker, but you don't, you can't gain the health while you kill a relic. It still comes down on turn 4, so they could develop stuff. So yes, it can disrupt a rat strategy, but I don't think like Ford Pride Leaders being main and one of the best decks in the format is going to stop Rats from actually being effective at executing its plan. More so aggro decks that can kill you by the time you try to kill them on turn 5 or 6 or 7, they're more effective at it.
Well, in that case, the weakness in the metagame is the fact that there aren't any aggro decks, right? If the deck that beats you isn't around, then you can play a deck that's really weak to a certain strategy and it just doesn't matter. And I think that's how you get decks that play a lot of bad cards to do well. Bad in quotation mark and in shock quotes, because it's based on how the cards interact with each other rather than the power of the cards on their own. So a few more examples as cards that really hold down certain archetypes. Sandstorm Titan, I think, is it's incredibly good against Skycrag aggro decks because they don't have a very effective way of dealing with it. Vara is another one. Vara dealing with all of the Aegises on cards. Like if you have some sort of Huru Aegis aggro deck, Vara is the card that absolutely keeps it down. Hailstorm for aggro decks, Annihilate for big time decks, Boar for decks that really rely on a lot of expensive attachments sticking, Gavel for Reanimator. I think that's another really good example. That might be just like the most black and white example for this, because if Reanimator faces against Feln Reanimator specifically, the old classic Feln Reanimator, if they face against a deck that plays a Gavel, they're basically cooked. There's not really much they can do. But if they don't, they've got a pretty favorable matchup against a wide variety of decks.
Now, interestingly, Gavel is also an example, I think, what Batteriez is saying, right? If your deck is playing just Gavel, if you're playing, for example, like Huru Control that just plays Gavel, the Reanimator deck can and will win. It's Gavel plus pressure that beats Reanimator. Because if you give Reanimator time, they will just burglarize your Gavel and then kill you anyways. But Gavel still slowing them down enough.
Assuming you can protect against their gavel, you just like if you transpose their burglarize. No, I think
That's
that,
true.
Yeah,
Okay,
I
well
think that
maybe
you're
like
swinging out.
FGS, right? Like wind chest. If you're playing wind chest with gavel, right, maybe you can't pressure fast enough to take advantage of the time that you're being given. But yes, gavel is an example. Like, one of the reasons that there was one of those like reanimator ECQs a few months ago that like Gallop did well on, and one of the reasons is because no one played gavel. Right? Everyone forgot reanimator existed, so no one played gavel, and so because no one's playing the reanimator, Reanimate got to sneak through there. That was what they tried to do with Hourglass for the Recano ECQ, but then like TBC Gate kept isomorphic with main deck what's it called embargo officer off of Crown Watch Press Gang. So they tried to do that, but then we're like, no, we're gonna remember Reanimator exists this time.
It's a very small cost in that deck also, just in having the one embargo officer.
Yeah.
So I mean, this just goes on to illustrate our earlier point of no deck exists in a vacuum, right? You can have a deck that is theoretically good in a vacuum, but how good it actually is really depends on what's going around. Scaly Gruin, 1/4. Cost 2 power. Doesn't seem like a great card, but if everyone is playing a deck where their 1-drops are 2/1s and their 2-drops are 3/1s, and they're expected to attack, Skelly Gruin looks real good.
Yeah, the other thing I wanted to mention about this fight, looking at the metagame, is look at like, and this especially applies to Expedition where everything's more limited, is like what removal is common and prevalent, right? And then find the units that dodge removal. If there are other decks, like say like Haru was super popular, which it isn't. Haru was super popular, and they're playing Just Desserts and Permafrost as their only removal spells. Then suddenly Sandstorm Titan looks really, really good. Sandstorm Titan dodges Permafrost and dodges Just Desserts as long as there's no blocker. Because if Just Desserts is common, find units with more health and attack. Permafrost is common, find units with endurance. Find the line, find the open line in the metagame and slide right in there.
Editing Sunyveil here, and we are going to stop here for this week. It's almost been an hour already. If you want to catch the rest of our discussion, including what we think about decks full of good cards, join us next week on FECast. So thanks for listening, and until next time, we'll see you in the friend zone. The Friends of Eternal Discord is the best place on the internet to get better at Eternal. We have players of all skill and experience levels all happy to help each other out on basically any aspect of their Eternal gameplay. And making all this possible is our generous patrons over at patreon.com. If you'd like to support FECast or Friends of Eternal, consider donating at patreon.com/Friends of Eternal. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, we'll see you in the Friend Zone.